In 1971, Philip Zimbardo, an American psychologist and a Stanford University professor, conducted this prison experiment. It was conducted at the basement of Stanford University, where a fake prison was created, and volunteers were given roles of prison guards and prisoners. Now, in a matter of a few days, what was found that the prison guards became progressively abusive and the prisoners became more and more traumatized and more submissive. So the experiment that was supposed to last 2 weeks had to be ended in 6 days. In another incident, in the 1970s, crime was at an all-time high in New York City. But what was surprising is by 1990s, the crime went down drastically, and nobody could understand how or why that happened. What was found out is that there were 2 changes that were made. Number 1, graffiti. All graffiti was cleaned up. And number 2, the fare beaters, the people who would not pay to use the subways, they were punished. And only by making these 2 changes, the crime went down drastically from the 1970s to 1990s in New York City. Now this is similar to the broken windows theory, which basically says that in any neighborhood, let's say if there's one broken window and if it is left unattended, soon another broken window is going to appear, and then another. And then there's going to be some spitting, then there's going to be something else. Now what it means is, if you pass through a neighborhood that has a lot of broken windows and dirt and disorder, it is signaling to you that no one cares. And if no one cares, that is an invitation for more serious disorder and more serious crime. Now why am I telling you this? Well, because we have to realize that our surroundings have a lot more influence on our behavior than we realize. How is this connected to forgiveness, which is what we are talking about today? How is it connected to self-forgiveness, forgiving yourself when you made that mistake, the one that you're beating yourself up about? Your surroundings or your environment was a much bigger player in the event than you realize. So small changes in your environment have big changes in your behavior. Those prison guards were normal people until they were put into roles that influence their behavior to be more abusive. Now, how is this connected to forgiveness at all? Most importantly, why is self-forgiveness important? Why do I need to stop beating myself up about a mistake that I made in the past? Well, because if you don't, let's first try to tackle the question of what happens if you are not able to forgive ourselves for something. Is that, number 1, it changes your capacity for joy. It changes your capacity for enjoying the world. Number 2, it changes your interaction with the world. It changes how you see the world. And most importantly, the most important thing that's probably exponentially more important than any of these things that I've said is that it changes your own relationship with yourself. And why is your own relationship with yourself important? You know, it's fine if I was watching the show yesterday where a really big shot Bollywood actor was saying that, I don't think therapy or mental health or these, fads are required because if you have baggage from the past, you can just forget about it. You can just drop it. While some people might be able to do it, it's not that easy to just drop memories from the past, just to drop the impact of those events, just to drop the impact of the decisions that you made. So, which is why self-forgiveness is super important, or self-forgiveness is crucial to the health of your own relationship with yourself. Because when crisis hits and you have to rely on somebody, and you can't rely on anybody else. The only person you can rely on is yourself. And if you can't even trust yourself, if your own relationship with yourself is damaged, how do you think you're going to do that? We hold ourselves to much higher standards than we hold others. We are much more self-critical than we are self-critical. If I don't forgive myself, I won't be able to forgive others. And naturally, my interactions with the world and myself are going to be soon corrupted. By the way, when I was struggling in my own closest relationships, I wish somebody gave me what I'm about to show you. I created India's first conflict resolution card game called Let's Fix It. It is a conversational tool that you can use to solve fights and conflicts with your loved ones. Relationships are like puzzles, and each fight reveals a missing piece. And most people avoid fights thinking that fights are going to damage relationships, when in reality, fights don't damage relationships. 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 relationships, when in reality, fights don't damage 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 relationships. A lack of repair damages relationships. And Let's Fix It is your repair tool. It helps you create stronger bonds, it helps you solve fights and build stronger emotional bonds, and to make your relationships bulletproof. Now, Let's Fix It is available at beingbeyond.in and on Amazon. Now, back to the video. I want to share with you a 4-step process, something that's very practical, something that's very applicable of how do you forgive yourself. I need you to bring out a pen and paper for this. Now, let me tell you how to manage regrets and forgive yourself. Now, on your pen and paper, I want you to make 4 columns. Step 1, I want you to write down what happened, scene by scene. Now, why we are doing this step is because often our memory is flawed. You know, we don't really remember everything correctly. We don't recollect experiences or events, past events correctly. When we put it down on paper, our memories of the event become much more accurate than if you just kept them in your mind. So I want you to sit and step by step 1, write down what exactly happened. And I want you to write it scene by scene, almost as if you were writing a play or a theater script. Now, step 2 is I want you to write down what you think by nobody else's standards, your own standards, because your own conscience is the judge. What is it that you think that you did right and what is it that you did wrong? So I'm going to repeat again. Step 1 was write everything that happened scene by scene. Step 2, what you did right and what you did wrong. Now, step 3 is what do you think now you would have done differently? So whatever steps you took, whatever decisions you took in the past in that event, I want you to now write down what you would have done differently with the information that you have now. And the last step, step 4, what you will do differently in the future. After you've done these 4 steps, I want you to sit down and really go through all of these 4 steps again. Read what you have written, really absorb it, sit with it, embody it. Because you just can't do an exercise once and then forget about it. We are trying to be effective here. The final question that I want you to ask yourself in this process is that, did I make the best possible use of the information that I had available to me at that point in time? If yes, awesome, great, your job is done here. You can let yourself off the hook. But if not, if you think you could have done better with the information available then, which means that your eyes were not as open as they could have been in order to absorb all the information that was presented to you or that was present around you. So, from this point onwards, make a promise to yourself to keep your eyes as open as possible, to stay as aware of the information around you so that you don't make the same mistakes again. And finally, you make better decisions that not only take care of your present self, but they also take care of your future self across space and time. I really hope this video helped, and if there's any questions you have for me around this topic, around self-forgiveness and managing regret, you can put them down in the comments below, and I'm gonna see you in the next video.